Great. So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming along to the AFMS seminar for this week. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Nicole Jones. So Nicole is an associate professor at the University of Western Australia. Her research interests include, I think, quite a large range of problems in oceanography, it's fair to say, including turbulent mixing, internal waves, and ocean eddies. And she uses a combination of field observations and numerical modelling techniques in her research. And she's going to talk about some of that today. So please take it away, Nicole.
Thanks very much, Kat. So today I'm going to talk about boundary layer problem in the ocean. And I guess my reason for choosing this topic was, I guess, the general appeal to our fluid mechanics audience, but also because this is some work that's kind of recently been completed that I think there'll be strong interest in. So of course this work is not something that I've done by myself. In fact, it's largely what I'll be presenting today is the work of one of my recent PhD graduates, Andrew Zilberti, and also work that Matt Rayson and Greg Ivey have participated in. So I thought I would start today by giving you a little bit of an introduction to our research group, because not all of you will be familiar with us. Then I'll start with an introduction to the topic of boundary layers. I'll show you how we observe the bottom boundary layer in the ocean, and then how we use those observations to characterise that boundary layer. We'll look at some of the near-bed turbulence characteristics, and also some of the particular properties around the boundary layer under nonlinear internal waves, and I'll finish with some conclusions. So I'm fortunate enough to be part of a wonderful research group, the Ocean Dynamics Research Group at UWA, and we consist of kind of three long-term academics in myself, Greg Ivey and Matt Rayson. And then we have a wonderful group of postdocs and PhD students who are here for shorter periods of time. So within our group, we primarily use a combination of field observations and numerical modelling to understand different ocean processes. And these, as Kat said, are quite wide-ranging, from the very small scales to much larger scales. And these are just some pictures of some of the work that we've done and numerical model output. So today I'm going to talk to you about boundary layer dynamics in the ocean, and I wasn't entirely sure who my audience would be today, so I'm starting at the very beginning, but I'm sure this is all very preliminary for you all. But when we're talking about a boundary layer, it's essentially that layer of fluid that's directly influenced by an object, whether it be very large scale, as in the object is the Earth, and we're talking about the atmospheric boundary layer, or that object can be very small. So if we're talking about the boundary layers that form within the veins in our body. When we're talking about geophysical boundary layers, then one defining aspect that's almost uniformly applicable is that they're turbulent boundary layers. So within the ocean, there are two very important boundary layers. One is the surface layer, and this is where a lot of the exchange of gases and momentum is occurring across that air-water interface. And so this is a very important boundary layer in the ocean. But today we're going to be talking about the bottom boundary layer. And this bottom boundary layer can be forced by a range of different processes, and depending on the dominant process, can really influence the height of that boundary layer. So if we're talking about surface waves of order 10-minute period, then we have quite a small boundary layer that's formed, up to very appreciable boundary layers formed over large scale flows, such as wind forced dynamics, where we have a bottom Ekman layer that results. So today we're going to talk about the bottom boundary layer, as I said, but we're also going to talk about our location, where the dominant forcing is the large tide, so the surface tide, the internal tide, and also these nonlinear internal waves, which have relatively short periods. And so you can see there's very complex layering of different processes that are happening, and some are dominant at some times and others are dominating at other times. And so this is what we'll explore today. So why do we care about ocean boundary layers, or I should say ocean bottom boundary layers? Well, they are the location where most of the energy in our mean flows is dissipating. And so for something like the dissipation of these packets of nonlinear internal waves, as they're going onshore, they shoal and start to steepen, but they also experience larger amounts of bottom friction as they're moving inshore. And so they're dissipating energy in this way as they travel. This also means that they can be a very important source of mixing, as they are dissipating the energy from whatever source, so whether it's from the tide or from the wind. In regions where we have near bed infrastructure, they're sitting within the ocean bottom boundary layer. And so understanding the dynamics of this boundary layer is important to making sure that these are designed in a safe way, so that we don't have things occurring like what's happened off the coast of California. It's also important from a biological point of view, because the boundary layer can both enhance and also prohibit mixing. And so if we think about organisms that are trying to survive within this bottom boundary layer, the process of mixing, for example, particles down to our deep sea corals, relies on mixing across the water column and all the way down to the bottom boundary layer. And it's also important to other transport processes such as sediment resuspension and transport, which is shown in this figure here, where the brown part of this figure is showing you the suspended sediment concentration, in this case under one of these nonlinear internal waves. So we're going to focus on observations that were taken at a location on the northwest shelf of Western Australia. So you can see that we're located up in this region here, where we're in about 250 metres of water, and we're quite a few hundred kilometres offshore. And this is Scott Reef, and there are some other smaller reefs out around this area and around the 200 metre contour as well. And this area is an area which is macrotidal, so there's very strong surface tides. We also have a very strong internal tide climate, and then these internal tides are being transformed in the shallow water as they steepen into nonlinear internal waves. So quite complex forcing. So we'll start with defining what an internal tide actually is. As I said, I don't know everyone's background, so I'll make sure that I cover all of the basics. So an internal tide is very similar to a surface wave, where because you have a density difference between two fluids, at the surface we have the density difference between the atmosphere and the water surface. Within the ocean we have different density layers. In this diagram we've simplified it into a two-layer ocean. So we have our warm light water overlying our colder heavier water. And when we perturb this interface, then a wave propagates away in either direction, with gravity as its restoring force. And one of the most common ways that this perturbation occurs is due to bottom topography. So if you have a surface tide that in deep water is purely horizontal, when it is when it sees a slope, then you get a vertical component to this tide that creates a perturbation at this interface that then propagates away as a wave. So the reality is that it all looks a little bit more complicated than this. So this is a numerical simulation that shows all of the dynamics that are occurring in this region. So what you're looking at is the free surface height gradient. So you can see internal tides radiating from these regions around the Indonesian archipelago that make their way all the way across. Our study site is over here. You can see internal tides that are generated at the continental slope as well and are moving onshore and offshore. And so we end up with this very complicated field. The very black colours here that you can see here are the amplified surface tide on the shelf. If we remove the dominant internal tide signal, which is what we've done on the right-hand side here, then you can see that there's still this complicated series of fronts and eddies and filaments in this region as well. And so you can see straight away that any of the stratification is not uniform across any location. It's going to be greatly varied and it's very three-dimensional for that point of view. So we'll see some effects of this as we go along. So how exactly do we undertake these observations of the bottom boundary layer in the ocean? Well, I just showed you the internal tides on the previous slide, but now I'll show you some model results of what happens to that internal tide as it moves into shallow water, because this is one of the processes that's important to us. And I put a mooring here to show you the approximate location that we've chosen at a depth of about 250 metres of water relative to these steepened nonlinear internal waves that make it past this site. So you can see we still have the large-scale signature of the internal tide. Here you're looking at the velocity in the cross-stream direction. And then with each internal tide, there's a steepening and a leading large amplitude, very steep wave, followed by a packet of waves. And so what we do to measure this is we put both through water column moorings to measure the temperature and velocity throughout the water column. Oh, it's not letting me, oh, there we go. So here is an example of one of our through water column moorings where we have a ADCP that measures currents at different heights from the bottom to the surface, and a series of measurements of temperature and salinity throughout the water column. And this allows us to measure the displacement of the constant density lines, which is what you're seeing here in the movie with the contours here. And because we want to focus on the near bed region, we also deployed a Bottomlander, which has a height of about 1 metre. And above that, we had a much higher resolution themystor string. Now, some of the complications of working in this type of environment is that these themystor strings are really just held in place by reasonably strong buoyancy, but in very strong currents, you can have displacement of this particular themystor line. And unfortunately, this has impacted a little bit our measurements, particularly at some of the most interesting times when the currents are particularly strong. So what does the profile of density look like? Well, this is showing you a ship-based profile over the entire water column at one instant in time. So you know from looking at this movie that the isotherms are actually being moved up and down with the internal tide and with the nonlinear internal waves, but this is just one instant in time. We can see that it's characterized by a reasonably well mixed surface layer. And then right down the bottom, if we look at this little inset, which is this bottom 20 meters of the profile, if we look at this blue line here, we can see that we've started to capture the near well-mixed region close to the bed. Now, it's probably a good thing to point out at this time that in our group, we resist calling these mixed layers and that we prefer the terminology mixing, because they're never completely well mixed. There's always some small gradients in density, and this plays quite an important role in the growth of the momentum boundary layer. So in reality, the Bottomlander frame looks like this. Of course, the umbrellas are actually removed for the deployment. They're just to protect the instruments from the fierce sun while they're on the back of the deck. So you can see on here acoustic Doppler velocimeter, which is co-located with this microsquid, which measures concurrently the temperature at high frequency. So we have a couple of those at about 0.5 metre off the bed and 1.4 metres off the bed. And then over the other side where you can't see, there's a high resolution acoustic Doppler current profiler that measures the mean and turbulent currents at about 8 Hertz. And then we also, of course, had that thermistor chain extending 20 metres off the bed at about 1 metre resolution. So when we put out our instruments, we tend to do quite short-term experiments to maximise the high-frequency data return and study particular processes, which I guess is quite different from some other ocean observations where we're more aiming to study long-term changes. So what we have out there as part of our integrated marine observing system is aimed at kind of 6-month turnaround so that we can leave instruments out over much longer periods of time. So what does this site look like? So this just, I'm just going to run you through some of the conditions that we experienced over well, I'm just going to show you 2 weeks of the record. So this is a full spring neap cycle. So you can see here that we have in the pressure record, very large surface tide at the beginning and about 2/3 of the way through the record. And then we have our neap tide at about day 5. And this is, of course, reflected then in the surface tide velocities where we have our minimums occurring around day 5. Now, the surface tide and the baroclinic tide, of course, don't line up in terms of their amplitudes. And this is because the internal tide is coming from somewhere else and it's propagating at a different speed to our surface tide. And so they're not in phase, although they do experience similar spring neap variability. So we can see if we look at the amplitude of the internal waves that we have actually captured some very large, a very large internal tide at the beginning of the record and towards the end of the record, with our minimum occurring at close to the middle of the record. And if we look in more detail at these amplitudes, where we can see these large squiggles are where we have our nonlinear internal waves. And so this is reflected as well in the velocity from the internal waves, where we have very large velocities coinciding with these largest amplitudes. You notice at the end of the record that the internal tide looks a lot more linear, and that we're not getting these packets, or large packets at least, of the nonlinear internal waves. So we had, within 2 weeks, a very nice contrast of conditions to study. And this is just now looking at these in a little more detail. So if we zoom in on the nonlinear internal wave period at the beginning of the record, we can see these very large oscillations of about 20-minute period of these packets of waves. We call these waves of depression because they're pushing the isotherms down from the surface towards the seabed as they pass by. And these green and pink colours are just indicating for each of the leading waves in these packets, the kind of before peak amplitude and just after peak amplitude is reached. And this is something we use to compare these two phases of the waves later on. And in contrast, at the end of the record, which we're going to call our spring tide more linear period, we can see that the internal tides don't have these very strong high frequency events occurring. Instead, there are some fluctuations, but it's a much more linear process, and that's also reflected in this amplitude, which is kind of a summary of the themista data above. So in order to look at the dynamics of the boundary layer, we first kind of need to put a measure of what the height is of that boundary layer. And I'm going to be a little bit careful now to change my terminology because really boundary layer is probably best describing the momentum, and we want to characterize our height or our thickness based on the stratification. So we're saying even though the boundary layer that's transferring momentum may decrease and increase again, and I'll show you some examples of this later on as the bottom stress changes, that the height of that region where it's generally quite well mixed is not influenced so much, or not influenced at these time scales, at least I should say. So if we look at this panel D here, we can see two different measures that we have of the mixing layer height. The first is where we have determined the buoyancy frequency and defined the mixing layer height based on that temperature gradient, so the density gradient. And so that's the dark black line, and the second line, the grey line, is showing you an estimate where we're just looking for a difference in temperature from the near bottom, the measurement taken closest to the bottom, and the height at which a certain temperature deviation is achieved. So there are two different measures of a gradient of temperature in order to characterize the height of that bottom mixing layer. So you can see that there's a lot of variation of both of these different ways of characterizing that mixing layer height over our 2-week record. And you can also see that there's quite a few gaps. And the gaps occur for two reasons. One is because of the knockdown of that 20-metre themista chain. And so when we don't know the positions of the themista in the water column, then we can no longer calculate height. And then also you have some periods where it seems to go beyond the range of where we have measurements, because that was limited to 20 metres. When we, because we have issues with gaps in this record, we also explored alternatives to using that themista chain to define the mixing layer height. And one of the obvious alternatives was to look at the backscatter from the ADCP. So this is a measure of the acoustic backscatter, which is kind of a proxy for the amount of sediment that's in the water column. And so you can see that in the bottom panel here. And you can see that there's quite a contrast in the intensity of this signal as you go from the near bed up the 20 metres over which it's measuring. And you can see that this fluctuates a lot with time. And so this gives us a continuous record if we pick out a particular level of intensity as our measure of our height and of our boundary layer. So here we're basically assuming that the sediment can always be mixed up to the height of that lower pycnocline, that near bed pycnocline, that's essentially trapping the transfer of momentum and material above that height. And so we're assuming that the sediment there's always enough momentum in order to resuspend the sediment into that highest portion of that well mixed region. And if we look at in more detail at one of our cases, so in this case it's the linear spring internal tide, we can see how two of these vary in more detail. So here in the grey line, we can see the temperature. So that's actually a temperature difference between the bottom and some height above it. And we can see the backscatter, which is the pink line, and you can see that's continuous. So first of all, we can note that the grey and the pink line over this period, which is a linear spring internal tide period, are tracking each other quite well. And then the other measure that's on here is the blue line, which is a measure of the inflection point of the velocity profile, so the near bed velocity profile. So on the right here, you can see the positive, so these parts here are the internal tide as it's moving on the shelf at the bottom, and this is the internal tide moving off the shelf, so negative velocities in part B of this figure. So each of these colours corresponds to a part of the figure along here. But really what I want to show you is that from each of these velocity profiles, we can choose a height of inflection of that velocity profile and form these blue lines here. And so this is a measure really of the momentum boundary layer height. And so you can see that on each tidal cycle, this height grows and reaches a value that then is very close to what is predicted from our other two measures. So our measure from the backscatter and our measure of the height from the temperature record. And this is repeated over and over again as the velocity goes back to close to zero. The momentum boundary layer is shrinking. And then as the velocity increases, whether the direction be onshore or offshore, that boundary layer height is growing and then reaching the height where it's matching that capped mixing layer. And so all of these pieces of information give us some confidence in what we're using as our characterizing the mixing layer height. But this also, data also nicely demonstrates that in terms of momentum, that we have growth that's occurring between each tidal cycle. So this is interesting in that when we look at this part of this phase of the flow, we can see that we're not going to be affecting our mixing of that capped area. But as the momentum grows, the momentum boundary layer grows and reaches the height of that capped layer, then that momentum is able to then work on mixing and increasing the overall height of that capped layer potentially. And we'll be looking at this in more detail later with some more finer scale measurements that we have. And it's important, and I don't think I've emphasised this enough yet, it's important to think about the fact that in this region, because we have the internal tide and the nonlinear internal waves are actively straining that region of the pycnocline, this near bed pycnocline, that we will get a growth and decay of that pycnocline purely because of the vertical velocities causing those depression and elevation then of the isotherms as they are in the water column. So this pink line that we're measuring, decreasing, increasing, is largely increasing and decreasing because of the straining of that of the pycnocline rather than actual changes in the growth due to mixing processes. So we've looked at this time series where we're looking in depth at a very very short period of time over a day, but it is relevant to be able to predict what that height of the mixing layer would be. And this is important for many reasons. You can imagine if you want to go back and do another field experiment, certainly would be a good thing to know for your planning. It also would be helpful to think about how you set up your ocean circulation model. Because if you have a mixing pycnocline that's unresolved, then you probably need to be more careful about the way that you're parameterizing your bottom dissipative losses. But you also, or you might think about adding extra vertical layers so that you can actually somewhat measure, or I shouldn't say measure, model the variation very close to the bed and capture that within your dynamics. So how can we come up with a basic model, a rule of thumb kind of model that characterizes the average mixing layer thickness? So here we're not trying to capture these variations, but we're trying to say, well, what is kind of the net effect of a particular stratification and bottom stress on producing a mixing layer height? So if we go back a little bit to the theory, the boundary layer thickness for an oscillatory mean flow scales like the bottom stress divided by omega, where omega is the frequency of your oscillation. So this tells us in an unstratified flow that for very short surface wave periods, we're going to have a very small boundary layer, but for a surface tide, that boundary layer has the potential to grow much larger for an equivalent U star, of course. But the problem is in a site like ours in the ocean, stratification is certainly playing a role. So that stratification can both suppress the growth of the turbulent eddies, and it also can act as a sink for the turbulent kinetic energy as it mixes that near bed fluid, and as a result increases the height of the boundary layer or the mixing layer. So in stratified controls boundary layers, we scale them as the height as the shear stress divided by the background stratification, N0. But in our case, because both the frequency and the background stratification are going to be important, as well as the bed stress, then we need something that is a function of all of those variables. So we went back and looked at an old formulation which included all of these parameters, and we were able to calculate from our data the average boundary layer, mixing layer height, and compare that to our average U star or our root mean square U star, our background stratification, and the forcing frequency being our 12.4 hour tide, which is applicable to both the internal tide as well as the surface tide at our site. And the two free parts to this equation are the coefficient out the front and this exponent here in the denominator. So this is what our average data looks like over the 2-week period. So you can see that, and this mixing layer height in the red line is based on our backscatter estimate of the mixing layer height. And the crosses and circles are showing you the results of two different models, one with the exponent gamma being equal to 1/4 and the other with gamma equal to 1/2. Now, the satisfactory thing about, or satisfying thing about gamma being equal to 1/2 is that this equation goes back to its limits, but interestingly, it appears that gamma is equal to 1/4, at least with the data that we've used, gives us a coefficient which is closer to order 1, and so perhaps this is a slightly better fit. But anyway, we probably can't distinguish with the current data sets that we're using, which includes our data, which is all of the circles here, and data from numerics. So this is from some of Bishak's work and some lake boundary layer observations that have been taken in the past. Either way, it is satisfying that we can come up with a reasonably good estimate of what we would expect our mixing layer height to be from knowledge of the bottom stress, the dominant forcing frequency and the background stratification at our site, which does help in setting up, as I say, numerical models as well as how we observe. So what we're going to have a look at next is some of the turbulence characteristics very close to the bed. And so here our primary objective was really to determine at what height the inertial sublayer was relevant. So I'll remind you that we only had 2 ADV measurements, and these were at height of about 1/2 metre off the bed and 1.4 metres off the bed. And so really we can't do it with any fine resolution, but we can compare those 2 different heights. So on the left here, you can see this is a summary of comparisons of shear production of turbulence to the dissipation of turbulent kinetic energy. And we would expect to see that if we're in the inertial sublayer, that these would be of equal value. And we can see that this is indeed the case, or close to the case, 1/2 metre off the bed. But as we go further off the bed, and particularly for our weaker forced cases, so our less energetic cases, that we're deviating from that 1-to-1 line. And just to remind you, the green points in here are the points that are at the leading face of the leading wave of depression, and the pink points are showing you the latter part of that leading wave. And so you can see that there doesn't really seem to be any deviation in the dynamics. So as in, the bottom boundary layer is, sorry, the inertial sublayer is behaving as expected in a classical sense at 1/2 metre off the bed, even when these internal waves, nonlinear internal waves, are passing by, which is quite different from what has been studied using kind of lab scale numerics over the past kind of decade or so. So this was a very interesting kind of field observation. In reality, it appears that the dynamics are much easier, I guess, to interpret. And then the right-hand side plots are comparing the magnitude of the turbulent kinetic energy to the streamwise turbulent stress. And so you can see again, so the line here is the 0.28 coefficient that we expect. And you can see that, again, the measurement close to the bottom is behaving as if the measurements were within the inertial sublayer, whereas we have far more deviation at the measurement that's a little bit further away from the bed. So the conclusion of all of this, and also looking at some spectra, is that closer to the bed, as in within 1/2 metre of the bed, it looks like we're always within the inertial sublayer, which means that a measurement here is a good measurement of the bottom stress, so that's a great thing. If we're any higher than that, so somewhere between 0.5 metre and 1.5 metres, and particularly for weaker flows, less energetic flows, then we would be outside of the inertial sublayer already. And to give some perspective for you all who are not field observationalists, putting that Bottomlander frame in 250 metres of water and taking measurements at these heights off the bed is really no trivial thing to achieve, and so really, if you look at what has been standard practice in the past, where people are taking observations at maybe 5 metres off the bed because they wanted to fit in acoustic releases, etc., underneath that, or even higher than that, 8 metres, and saying that's their bottom measurement, then there's a real issue with the interpretation of those measurements. So for people who do lab work and numerics, this might not seem so amazing, but from a field perspective, these are really some of the first observations that are really sorting this stuff out in such a complicated location. So now we're just going to explore briefly what happens under one nonlinear internal wave. And so, as I mentioned before, the straining of the isopycnals is quite important to all of this process. And what we see as the isotherms are pushed down as the wave passes by is that we get a very strong, we get a very strong response from the near bed velocity. So we get our highest velocities close to the bed, and these are the measurements that are at our ADV heights. And then we also get a response in our turbulent kinetic energy and our stress, where the largest parts are occurring at the coincident with this time when the isotherms are compressed closest to the bed. And so if you think about this in terms of processes such as sediment transport and the growth of the momentum boundary layer, it's all a very dynamic process. And although the vertical velocities are obviously zero at the bed, they get to be quite large off the bed, small distance off the bed, and the processes of transport of turbulence in this region can be quite different to what we might traditionally expect. And we also see then the response of the sediment coincident with this. So when we get our larger shear stresses, we get a build-up of very concentrated sediment under this depressed wave that then is, as the wave passes by and the isotherms pick back up, is mixed to a much greater height, transported to a much greater height. I'll skip over this because we're kind of running out of time. So, something I did want to emphasize is that we have these very high resolution measurements from the acoustic backscatter, because that's also measuring at 8 Hertz. And so I've been a bit lazy with my presentation here, but these were collected in time, but we've converted them using a mean velocity to distance, so we can compare length scales at different times within this passage of this nonlinear internal wave. So I think what you can see here is some of the coherent structures that are probably at the top of the momentum boundary layer as it grows through the cycle of this wave. So C is just before the wave meets its peak amplitude. And then we can see as the wave is passing by, so just after the trough, we can see these coherent structures, but not reaching the height of our mixing layer. And then as the momentum boundary layer grows closer to the height of that mixing layer, those coherent structures, I believe, will be the ones that are responsible, those instabilities will be the ones that are responsible for the mixing across that picnic line. And so I also want to kind of connect this a little bit to the work that Maddie has started since she's begun here, and she's done some wonderful work using LES models to start to really diagnose the process of growth of the momentum and mixing boundary layer regions. And this is just showing the results of a simulation where it's just forced by a tide on a flat bottom. But you can see at this interface region between the stratified fluid above and the mixing region below that we have the evolution in part of the flow, and this is just looking in one plane, what looks very much like Kelvin-Helmholtz billows. And so this is quite reminiscent, I think, of some of the coherent structures that we're seeing in this acoustic backscatter signal, in this case under the nonlinear internal waves. And so it'll be great to see how we can progress in this understanding with Maddie's work. And hopefully soon she'll be able to present this in its entirety to you. So to finish off with, I want to, I guess, summarise that the bottom mixing layer thickness varied with tidal frequency and forcing, but it was on average 10 metres thick, and within about that lowest 1 metre of this layer, we had an inertial sublayer. And so this kind of concurs with the general observation of the inertial sublayer being about 10% of the bottom boundary layer. And we found that at an instantaneous kind of time scale, the mixing layer thickness was dominated by that internal wave pumping, but the strength of the ambient stratification, the frequency of the oscillation were important controls on the time average boundary layer thickness. And this gives us a nice way of designing future observational studies. It also offers guidance for the configuration and discretization of the 3D RANs, so Reynolds average Navier-Stokes type ocean models. It certainly allows other people who are doing lab and lab scale numerics to configure numerical studies where they're looking at these nonlinear internal waves and turbulence interaction in a more realistic way, because we believe that some of the problem is that a lot of these studies previously were done without any background turbulence, which is really not the case in the ocean. And of course, from an engineering point of view, it allows us to take better observations and make better predictions of what the hydrodynamic loads would be on subsea infrastructure. And I would just like to finish by drawing your attention to two papers that summarise the vast majority of this work. Of course, there are others that I've also touched on, but these you can find all of these papers if you go to my Google Scholar or my UWA research repository. But these are the two that I wanted to draw your attention to from today. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of our funding bodies and access to observation and supercomputing.
Great, so thank you so much, Nicole. That was a fantastic talk. I actually had a question written down here saying, are they KH billows? And kind of implied that maybe they are, so that question got answered. But yes, we do have time for questions. If you're in the audience, you can either type in the chat or just unmute yourself and, the other option is, of course, just to put your hand up and we can call on you. While people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I might ask a quick question, which was kind of just, it's kind of a broad question. So I guess why in particular did you choose this area to take observations? Is it kind of ubiquitous to a lot of other places in the ocean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So when we're attempting to do these very kind of detailed process-oriented studies, we tend to go to a site that we have some previous information about, and so for us, it was a choice. So there's some past industry observations that we'd had access to at this location. So no turbulence observations, but mean current. We knew what dynamics we were expecting. Matt had already done some numerical modelling in this vicinity. So we tend to plan and think about our field campaigns in that respect. But that being said, a lot of the dynamics would be at play across many regions throughout the world's oceans. So, you know, the Northwest Shelf is certainly not the only shelf with nonlinear internal waves. The majority of the world's ocean have some reasonably steep waves. We do have a very strong surface tide, which is maybe not replicated everywhere around the world. We do have a very broad shelf on the Northwest Shelf. So there are, you know, there's differences and there's similarities between different sites. The benefit that we have on in this region is that the kind of signal to noise ratio is pretty strong. So it's a good signal to measure, but a very complicated set of different processes. Hard to avoid in the real world, really.
Cool, thanks. That answers my question. Richard, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Nicole. Firstly, thank you for a very clear and very interesting talk. I'm interested in the definition of nonlinearity that you're using at the moment. You keep mentioning that they're nonlinear. It's very clear from your time series that on 12-hour astronomical forcing timescale, that's looking pretty nonlinear, and not sinusoidal, at least. One measure of nonlinearity is the ratio of the amplitude to the wavelength. And I'm interested in your opinion what that ratio might be, because when that ratio gets large, you can have the waves behaving like solitary waves and possibly transporting mass within them. So how nonlinear are the waves with that length ratio?
I can't give you an exact number for the ratio. I can't remember, but these waves are, yeah, these waves are, we haven't found much evidence in these particular waves of depression that they're transporting mass. Certainly in other observations in shallow water, where we've got waves of elevation and they're more acting like boluses, we certainly do have transport of mass within them, and it's very clear from our observations that we have that. At this site, we also get a lot of mode 2 waves, so waves where the isotherms are going in opposite directions, and certainly within those we've observed that we have convective overturns, and that those waves are breaking, actively breaking. But yeah, the focus on this has very much been in actually the area beneath the wave, close to the bottom boundary layer. And I'm not sure that we have quite the resolution of measurements that we need to answer those problems from a observational perspective, but certainly some of the other studies that we've done recently where we're actually really trying to resolve within the core of the wave what's going on might be of interest to you.
Oh, thank you. And if I can still hog the floor with another question, this is a naughty question, but there was a disaster earlier this year when an Indonesian submarine was lost, and it's been speculated that internal waves were responsible. Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't know that much about submarines, so I don't know from that perspective so much. My sense is that if a submarine was in trouble already, then the magnitudes of the velocities from these internal waves and the extent of their depression could then make it catastrophic, as in it could be projected to depths beyond what it was pressure rated to be at. But in my mind, with, as I say, no knowledge of real knowledge of submarines, I would think that they would be designed to withheld their depth with reasonably strong vertical velocities, and so it would need some kind of failure first. But yeah, very unprofessional opinion.
That's fine. That's okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Yep. That was a bit left field question there, Richard.
Yeah.
A little bit unfair, but
I have thought about it.
Well,
We've discussed.
We have another hand up. So Simon, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk, Nicole. Just a question again about the nonlinearity of the waves and the when you get the breaking of or effectively the breaking of the waves and forming into a train of solitary waves. Roger Grimshaw and his colleagues have done a lot of work on modelling that as transitions from, say, the KdV equation to the modified KdV equation and things like that. Do you have any evidence that it's going through some kind of phase transition where the effect of the nonlinearity is causing a problem, is causing that breaking at all, or that's the, yeah.
By breaking, do you mean the transition from? Are you referring to the transition from the linear internal tide, or
when it starts to become a nonlinear internal wave? The nonlinear internal waves that you were talking about were effectively getting close to overturning, and then you get a train of solitary waves forming out of that, it forming into an undulate bore.
Yeah, so I mean, we also do a lot of KdV simulations, as well as non-hydrostatic numerical modelling at high resolution to look at evolution of the waves across the shelf, not just at this location, but at other locations. And this gives us, I guess, a lot of knowledge of what we think is occurring and over what distance we think the steepening is occurring. So that simulation that I showed you at the beginning, where I just had the slice of the field site showing the moorings, that was a KdV solution. So that gives an indication of where that would occur relative to our site.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Great. So we have another question. This is assuming you can stick around, Nicole.
Yeah.
Pass that out. Great. Go ahead, Alexander.
Nicole, thank you for talking to us in Melbourne. It's a curiosity question. In one of your earlier slides, you showed a depth of the mixed layer, or mixing layer, as you call it, of 200 meters in April.
Oh no, it was about 50 meters at that time. Zero is the bottom, and it was 250 meters at the surface.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
A reference frame problem. Yeah, it's in the Northwest Shelf, summertime, tens of meters, wintertime, 100 meters, cyclone, maybe 150 meters. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have another question from Vishak this time.
Hi, Nicole. Very lovely talk, actually. Hey, I have one question regarding what is called the scaling. So this scaling has both effect of frequency as well as stratification. So do you expect this is also like a effect of rotation, because when you apply this scaling in other parts of the ocean, so we can still use this scaling, or we can include the rotation in this scaling?
I guess my answer to that is probably you need to make a choice depending on what your dominant forcing is. So we believe that it appears to be transferable, and Maddie's doing a lot more work on that now, where she's able to isolate with, you know, her numerics, as you know, the different frequencies and look at the response. But in the notion application, you would have to decide what your dominant forcing frequency was in order to be able to use it. Does that answer your question?
Yes. No, thank you. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, applicability in a major part of the oceans, actually. So it's very beautiful for this location. So can we take it to the tropics or in the subpolar regions? Yeah.
Mm.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? Cool. Otherwise, I think we might thank Nicole one more time, and I'll end the seminar there. We can stop the recording, I think.
Yep, thanks very much, everyone, and all the best to everyone that's in lockdown. We do feel kind of guilty here in Perth.